You're inside a stone synagogue in Galilee, oil lamps flickering against the walls, and a man with a withered hand just sat down 3 rows ahead. You've read 37 miracles. Every one of them was targeted. The private ones trained the disciples, the public ones built the fame, the border ones broke into Gentile territory, and the ones performed on the Sabbath, directly in front of the Pharisees, were deliberate confrontations that escalated step by step until the only option left was to kill him. That escalation starts here. Along the far wall sits a group of Pharisees. They're not here to pray, they're here to watch. Jesus sees the man, he sees the Pharisees, he knows exactly what's about to happen, and he tells the man to stand up anyway. Mark chapter 3 verse 6 records what the Pharisees do next. They walk out and immediately plot with the Herodians, the political supporters of King Herod's family, to kill him. The very first murder plot against Jesus. Not triggered by a resurrection, not triggered by walking on water, triggered by a Sabbath healing, performed directly in front of the people who were watching to accuse him. The miracle wasn't performed despite the audience, it was performed because of them. Think about that for a second. This was a synagogue. Everyone knew the rules, and Jesus healed anyway. 4 audiences, 4 functions, 1 escalation that ends at a cross. Why were some miracles performed only for the disciples, with no crowd present and no one healed? Why did the only miracle in all 4 Gospels trigger a political crisis so severe that Jesus had to flee? And why did the Pharisees never once deny the miracles happened? And what did they do instead that led to a death sentence? If you've ever felt like doing the right thing made your situation worse, that the very act of compassion created the conflict, you're watching the same pattern play out in a Galilean synagogue 2,000 years ago. But if the miracles aimed at the Pharisees were designed to provoke, what were the miracles no Pharisee ever saw? There's a category of miracle that no crowd ever saw. No Pharisee was present. No one was healed. And these might be the most important ones in the entire catalog. The stilling of the storm in Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 through 27. The disciples are in a boat. A storm hits. They're terrified. Jesus stops the wind with a word, and their response isn't gratitude. It's not relief. It's a question. Who is this man, that even the winds and the sea obey him? Notice the question. Not thank you. Not that was amazing. The question is, who is this man? Walking on water, in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Peter is singled out. His faith is tested individually, not as part of a group. The coin in the fish's mouth, in Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 through 27. Completely private, completely practical. No public dimension at all. And the post-resurrection catch of 153 fish, in John chapter 21, verses 4 through 11. The final private miracle, the last training exercise before Jesus leaves. If you've ever had a moment where a crisis forced you to decide what you actually believed, not what you said you believed, but what you trusted when the floor dropped out, that's what the storm was for. The storm wasn't an inconvenience Jesus fixed. It was a classroom. And the test wasn't whether they could survive it. The test was whether they knew who was in the boat. Every private miracle forced one question. Who is this man? Not one of them was performed for an audience. Every one of them was performed for the people who would have to carry the answer after Jesus was gone. If that synagogue healing was targeted at the Pharisees, and the private miracles were targeted at the disciples, what about the miracles performed for the largest possible audience, the ones that built the fame? Were those targeted too, or just compassion on a bigger scale? There's a moment in the Gospels where a miracle works too well. The audience does exactly what the miracle was designed to provoke, and Jesus has to run. Early in the Galilean ministry, the crowd miracles build fast. Mass healings at Capernaum, in Matthew chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. Mark records that Jesus could no longer openly enter a city because of the crowds. The healing of a leper, in Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45. Jesus commands silence. The man tells everyone anyway. The fame spiral accelerates. And then comes the feeding of the 5,000. This is the only miracle recorded in all 4 Gospels. All 4. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That almost never happens. Think about what that tells you about how important this moment was. 5,000 men, plus women and children. The biggest audience of Jesus' entire ministry. And John chapter 6 verse 15 records what happened next. The crowd tried to make Jesus king by force. He withdrew immediately to a mountain alone. The crowd wanted a king who could feed them. They got one, and the first thing he did was disappear. Sometimes the thing you want most from someone is the thing they refuse to give you, because they're offering something bigger. The feeding of the 5,000 wasn't random compassion at scale. It was so successful as a public event that it provoked a political crisis Jesus had to escape. The crowd miracle had done exactly what it was designed to do. It proved his power to the widest possible audience. And the moment the audience tried to use that power for their own purposes, he was gone. The crowd miracles built the center of the board. The private miracles built the back row. But then something strange happens. The miracles leave Jewish territory entirely. Right after the Pharisees confronted Jesus about food laws, what's clean, what's unclean, what can be eaten and what can't, Jesus left Jewish territory entirely. And the next 3 miracles happened on the other side of the border. The Canaanite woman's daughter in Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. A Gentile mother from the region of Tyre and Sidon, in modern-day Lebanon, crosses every boundary to ask for help. Jesus initially resists. The woman's faith changes the encounter. The healing of a deaf mute in the Decapolis, a group of 10 Greek-speaking cities on the eastern border of Jewish territory, recorded only in Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. And then the feeding of the 4,000. A second feeding. This time for a Gentile crowd. Different location, different ethnicity, different number of baskets. Jesus later references both feedings separately in Matthew chapter 16, verses 9 and 10, making it clear these were 2 distinct events. Notice the geography. It's not random. The text is showing you something. If you've ever felt like you were on the outside of a community that claimed to welcome everyone, if you've ever been the person at the border wondering whether the door was really open, you're watching the moment where the door swung wide. Think of it like a chess player who's been making moves on one side of the board for the entire game. The crowd miracles built the center. The disciple miracles built the back row. And then suddenly, the pieces crossed the board into territory no one expected. The Gentile miracles aren't a detour. They're the expansion that makes the endgame possible. If you're starting to see a pattern in these miracles that you've never noticed before, hit subscribe. We break down every person, place, and story in the Bible, just like this. So let's take a breath and look at where we've been. 37 miracles, and so far, we've seen 3 completely different audiences. The private miracles train the disciples. Every storm and every catch of fish forced them to answer who Jesus was. The crowd miracles built the fame, until the feeding of the 5,000 triggered a kingship crisis and Jesus had to withdraw. And the border miracles expanded the territory into Gentile land, right after the Pharisees drew the line on what was clean and unclean. 3 audiences, 3 functions. But the 4th audience, the one that was watching from the very beginning, never denied a single miracle. There's one detail in the Gospels that almost nobody talks about. The Pharisees never denied the miracles, not once. They never said the healing didn't happen. Their argument was never about whether. It was always about who. The paralytic lowered through the roof in Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Scribes are present. They accuse Jesus of blasphemy in their hearts. No public action, just a quiet objection. The withered hand on the Sabbath, in Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. We've already seen this one. The Pharisees plot with the Herodians to kill him. First murder plot. The escalation jumps from silence to execution planning in a single step. The blind mute demoniac, in Matthew chapter 12, verses 22 and 23. The crowds are amazed. The Pharisees publicly attribute the miracle to Beelzebul, the prince of demons. A deliberate insult meaning Jesus' power comes from Satan. This isn't doubt. This is public delegitimization. The healing at the pool of Bethesda, in John chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. Sabbath, Jerusalem. The Jerusalem authorities begin persecuting Jesus. The man born blind in John chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. Another Sabbath, another healing. But this time the Pharisees convene a formal investigation. The healed man is interrogated. His parents are too afraid to speak. He stands alone. When they can't break his testimony, they expel him from the synagogue. Jesus goes and finds him. If you've ever seen someone do something undeniably good, and watch the people in charge find a reason to call it wrong, not because it was wrong, but because they didn't control it, you're watching the Pharisees in real time. Notice what they're not saying at any point in this sequence. They're not saying it didn't happen. They're saying he did it with the wrong power, or on the wrong day. or without the right authority. That's a completely different argument. The Pharisees accepted the miracles as real and shifted the argument to authority and source. And their response followed a traceable sequence: silent accusation, murder plot, public delegitimization, formal judicial inquiry. Each rung higher than the last, each one narrowing the options until only one response remained. The private miracles trained the team. The crowd miracles built the fame. The border miracles expanded the territory. But there's one miracle that skipped every remaining rung and went straight to the top. One miracle that forced the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Jewish Council, into an emergency session with a single agenda item. Every other miracle on the escalation ladder gave the Pharisees room to maneuver. They could argue the source. They could challenge the timing. They could open an investigation. But you can't investigate a man who was dead for 4 days and is now eating dinner. Lazarus had been dead 4 days. Martha, his sister, says by this time there's a stench. John chapter 11, verse 39. That detail eliminates the not really dead objection in a single sentence. Jesus performs the miracle in front of a large public crowd from Jerusalem. Many believe. Some go straight to the Pharisees. John chapter 11, verses 47 and 48 records the exact reasoning of the emergency council. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation. Read that sentence again. They're not saying the miracle was fake. They're not arguing theology. They're doing political math. The concern is institutional survival. John chapter 11, verse 53. From that day on, they plotted to take his life. The formal decision. And John chapter 12, verse 10 adds one more detail. The chief priests also planned to kill Lazarus, because on account of him, many people were going over to Jesus. Here's what makes this even more striking. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't include the Lazarus miracle at all. Scholars propose what they call protective anonymity. Those 3 Gospels were written early enough that naming Lazarus by name would have endangered him, since John tells us the chief priests were actively planning to kill him. John wrote his Gospel decades later, around 90 to 95 AD, by which time Lazarus had died of natural causes. The absence of Lazarus from the other Gospels may not be evidence of doubt. It may be evidence of protection. If you've ever watched a group of powerful people make a decision they knew was wrong because they couldn't afford the alternative, you're reading John chapter 11. Imagine you're playing a card game and your opponent keeps laying down cards you can't beat. You can challenge the cards. You can question the rules. You can accuse the dealer. But at some point you have only 2 choices left. Concede the game or flip the table. The Sanhedrin flipped the table, and the card that forced their hand was a dead man walking out of a tomb. If Lazarus triggered the death sentence, what was the very last miracle Jesus performed? After the Lazarus miracle, Jesus performed 2 more. One was a curse. The other was a healing for an enemy. The cursing of the fig tree in Matthew chapter 21, verses 18 through 22. The only destructive miracle in the entire catalog. A fig tree with leaves but no fruit. Scholars read it as a symbolic judgment on the temple establishment that had the appearance of faithfulness, but produced nothing. And the healing of Malchus's ear in Luke chapter 22, verses 50 and 51. The very last healing. A servant of the high priest, in the garden of arrest. Jesus heals the man who came to take him to his death. Stop and picture that for a second. The last miracle before the cross was an act of compassion for the person arresting him. Even at the end, the audience still determined the function. The pattern comes full circle. In a synagogue in Galilee, a man with a withered hand stretched it out in front of Pharisees who couldn't stop watching. That was the first miracle aimed at the people who would kill him. The last one aimed at them walked out of a tomb in Bethany, 4 days dead, in front of a crowd from Jerusalem. And within hours, the Sanhedrin convened the session that would end everything. Same structure, same audience, same question the religious leaders could never answer. If this man is not from God, then explain the dead man walking. 37 miracles, not one of them random, not one of them wasted. And the audience that watched the most carefully, the one that never denied what they saw, is the one that decided he had to die for it.